Good afternoon. Welcome to the debate organized by the European Movement International on the occasion of the International Women's Day, discussing participation of women in European democratic life. Happy International Women's Day to all the women out there, and this is really an opportunity to celebrate all of the women in the history who have contributed to the achievement of the political, economic, and social rights of women across the world. Of course, the job has not been done yet. Europe has achieved a lot, but women today still face a number of issues. COVID crisis has exacerbated the violence and gender-based violence and domestic violence issue, which will be actually discussed today in the European Commission, coming out with a number of proposals regarding the issue and how the national governments can curtail the problem. Women today also still fight for the equal pay. They fight for the access to the decision-making and policy-making positions. They fight for the right to decide about their own lives and their own bodies. COVID crisis has also shown us that women working in the service sector have really bore the majority of the crisis problems. But all of these issues really deserve a lot of our attention. Today, we want to discuss inclusiveness of the European governance and European democracy, and how well represented women are in politics and democratic life at large. We are still far from the gender parity, and this is what European Movement International, together with a number of civil society organizations and individuals across Europe, is really advocating for more than 70 years now. We have a really exquisite line of high-level speakers, women speakers, coming from the civil society in Europe. First with us is Anke Stock, Senior Gender Expert and Programs Coordinator at Women Engage for Common Future. Anke, welcome from Munich. Then we have Patricia Heidegger, Director for Global Policies and Sustainability at European Environmental Bureau. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you for joining us. Then Jeromine Andolfato, Policy and Campaigns Officer at European Women's Lobby. Welcome, Jeromine. And last but not the least, we have Heather Graby, Director of Open Society European Policy Institute. We have only 1 hour and so many issues to discuss. I will start by asking you a couple of questions, and then we will, of course, pick up the comments and questions coming from the audience. You who are following us on social media platforms and where we broadcast this event can really pose a question on any of these, and we will be collecting them. And in the second half of the event, we will be posing those questions to our today's speaker. I will not start in the order that I presented the speakers, but I will start with Jeromine, who is working in the European Women's Lobby, a network of women civil society organizations, tackling a number of issues and challenges and problems women face today, not only in political life and democratic life. But I want to start with you and ask you how well represented are women today in Europe in politics and democratic life at large in different levels, European, national, regional, local. What is the data showing us, and why they are underrepresented, if I can immediately make this conclusion? Jeromine.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be able to participate in this discussion. So in terms of, you mentioned participation and representation. So I just want to highlight that at the European Women's Lobby, we work on participation, but mostly focus on representation. So participation would be the opportunities for women to be involved in political life, in the different political arenas through activism, votes, and campaigning. And representation is more the access they have to decision-making position, and then the opportunity they have to truly influence political outcomes. So we focus a lot on representation. And you asked me about what is the reality and the situation today. So we have seen progress in recent years. So I'm going to focus mostly on EU level because that's what we specialize on. You see that in the European Parliament, currently there are 39% of members that are women, and about half of the College of Commissioners are women, which is a progress and it's encouraging, but there is still a lot to do in terms of vertical segregation, but also horizontal segregation, because the reality is once you get in the decision-making position, after that, you realize that there is also like a divide between the kind of topics women can focus on and the real influence they have on things. So a lot of women, for instance, in the European Parliament, in committees, you have a majority of women focusing on what we call soft portfolios. So for instance, social affairs, education, while men mostly concentrate in, let's say, more basic function portfolio like foreign affairs, economy, etc. And just a few more data to set the scene. In EU member states, currently you have only 18% of women among presidents and prime minister, and 26% of leaders of major political party or deputy leaders. So we can see that we still have a long way to go in terms of representation, and also to ensure diverse representation and the diversity of women we have in Europe. Obviously, it changes from one European country to another. For instance, in Finland, you have 47% of women in the parliament, when, for instance, in Malta, it's only 15% or 13% in Hungary. So, and you mentioned the COVID crisis. So I think one interesting data there is we have noticed that during the answer to the crisis, women were obviously not equally represented, unfortunately still. For instance, you have only 1/4 of health ministers in the EU that are men, when women have been disproportionately affected by the crisis because they are most of the frontliner. There is a huge proportion of women in the care economy sector. So that's quite telling. And EGE, in its Gender Equality Index of last year, highlighted the fact that in countries where there is no mandatory quotas for an equal representation of women in decision-making position, these countries will at least need 60 years to reach gender parity in the parliaments, when countries with mandatory quotas would need around 20 years. So it's still a long time, but we can see the necessity of quotas. And why I think there are many barriers, so maybe we can develop on that a bit later on, or I don't know if you want me to continue now, but if not, I can focus on the obstacle afterwards.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am going to come back to you about the barriers and what are the causes for this situation. And thank you for mentioning some of the instruments that can address the problem, like the quotas. But now I would like to ask Anke Stock, who is working in organization network of the civil society organizations that try to bring women perspective and gender equality in environmental policies and climate and sustainable development policies. And I was wondering, how do you go around about this, and how do you implement this intention of the network when it comes to the different global policies in the environment and climate area? And what is the situation?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maya, and good afternoon. Yes, Women Engaged for Common Future is a network of organizations globally, and we work with around 150 partners. And obviously, we work on the one hand, we work on implementation projects, and on the other hand, we also work on advocacy. So we have similar approaches when we kind of try to engage women in this work, but still they differ. So if we go around our local partners and implementing projects on sustainable development and gender equality, we really focus on empowering women in the different national or regional contexts. So we try to develop projects together to really see where would women benefit. And here, for example, the participation of women sometimes really needs very specific approaches and tools, because it depends on the conditions on the grounds. And here we rely on the gender expertise of our partners, who kind of sometimes would then ask us to have meetings at specific times in order to meet a typical schedule of a woman in that context. Or we also have separate meetings with only women and only men, and try to moderate then what we really want to have in these projects and what they want to see coming out of these projects. So we also have mentoring programs, again, with the expertise of our local partners. We try to support women to really take up leads in the projects, in specific activities. Sometimes that really leads then towards the fact that women gain so much respect in the community that they have chances to get elected at local elections then. So we have there some really nice experiences and also successes. On the advocacy level, what we try to do is to engage our local partners, those who are really interested also in taking their voices to the international platform, to take them with us to international negotiations. For example, at the climate COP, since last 7 years, we have started a program which is called the Gender Just Climate Solutions. There we enable our partners to show their gender just solutions on climate mitigation or also adaptation, and present them in a kind of awards ceremony to decision makers at the global level. And we have, for example, non-technical solutions. Last year, a partner it's not a partner, it's actually just a local grassroots organization from Guatemala won the prize where they were empowering indigenous women in Guatemala for climate resilient food sovereignty. And then we also have technical solutions, so we have both parts there. We also have mentoring programs on the international arena. So 2 years ago, when there was the Beijing +25 Jubilee year, we kind of had a organized travel support for young feminists and trainings in order to take part in international negotiations as the Commission on the Status of Women or the High-Level Political Forum. Of course, Corona and COVID kind of was a challenge to us, but we kind of tried to get that in the virtual arena. So we had consultations there, and we still trained them, and they could be mentees for other young feminists. And then we also organize or are organized in other feminist spaces like the Women's Major Group, which is an umbrella organization of gender and women's organizations working on sustainable development, and the Women and Gender Constituency being active at the UNFCCC, at the climate negotiations, and then the Women's Rights Caucus, which is active on the Commission on the Status of Women. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. You're saying it's such a crucial policy and the aspect of our lives and the future of planet, and we are staying in this arena. And I would like to refer to Patricia, who is working in European Environmental Bureau. You're following Sustainable Development Goals implementation. You're working on different intergovernmental policies at global and regional level. You're also involved in the experiment that is about to end, but hopefully some form will continue, that the EU has introduced on the Conference on the Future of Europe as an environmental civil society representative. And I wanted to ask you, when it comes to the conference and this deliberative platform, it was mentioned and observed and noticed that level of contribution coming from women on the platform itself was really quite low. And what would be the reason why it was not so accessible for women participation, but also more in general, what is the representation of women when it comes to policy making and implementation in the environmental and climate sectors.
Thanks a lot, Maya, and hello, everybody. So, yeah, I mean, I can start with the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is, as you've said, a very interesting experiment. It's the biggest deliberative process that the EU or the European institutions have ever set up in their long history. I mean, it has shown really quickly when the online platform was set up, which is one of the three main channels of that conference process, next to the citizens panels and the conference plenary, that only around 15% of the users self-identified as women. And I think, I mean, that's obviously very concerning, because 15% is very low. But what I found even more concerning was the fact that this was not really perceived as a major problem. I mean, of course, this figure was kind of called out by people like us, civil society representatives, but I didn't have the impression that those behind the process were particularly concerned about the fact that women just seem not to be attracted by that online platform, or that there were reasons why they did not use it to express their ideas and concerns in that process. And I think this is maybe telling about a wider problem, which is, which we've seen in this conference process, but maybe also beyond in when we talk about participation, representation in decision making and in policy making in Europe and beyond, that we maybe too quickly assume that if we create a space which is apparently open, to everyone, that we just assume that if we put that space up, that it will be filled by people in all their diversity, and this just doesn't happen. So there are reasons that keep people from participating, whether that's the question, do they even know about the process? Do they feel invited to that space? Do they feel safe in that space? Do they feel this is their space? And obviously that online platform was not a space where women users felt very much welcome, for reasons I don't know. And but so it's important that if we kind of set up, for instance, deliberative processes like the Conference on the Future of Europe, that we think beforehand, how do we have to set up a process that becomes inclusive, and what kind of maybe additional measures do we need to make sure that we have gender balance, that we have balance in terms of age, in terms of educational backgrounds. There was a lot of criticism in that process as well about the lack of people of color, European people of color who were not that visible in the process. There was criticism around accessibility in the process for people with disabilities. So there were different concerns around inclusiveness and representativeness of the process. And to make sure that a process becomes inclusive, you probably have to go the extra mile. You cannot just expect that if you open the doors, everybody will come in, and populate the space. But going beyond the Conference on the Future of Europe, and building upon also linking to what Anke has already said, we are particularly interested in the question of women representation, women participation in environmental, climate, sustainability, policy making, and decision making. And of course, here we see what we have heard before from other policy areas. Of course, we still see an underrepresentation of women, whether that's on environmental committees and parliaments, whether that's the percentage of environment ministers. I think it's around 30% at the moment in Europe. Or female negotiators in international climate and environmental negotiations. In all these spaces, we see a very clear underrepresentation of women. We also see, and that's also, I think, very important for the whole discussion on the transition towards carbon neutrality, the toxic-free future, that also the key sectors that we need to change for decarbonization are sectors that are very male-dominated. It's transport, it's construction, it's agriculture. All these sectors that are the main contributors to, and the energy sector, obviously, the main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and the sectors that need to go through the biggest and maybe most profound changes are sectors where we see a lot of workplace segregation, where we have very little women workers there. So there's, on the one hand, a risk that in the transition, women are even further left behind in terms of the job gap that we already have. If we create more green jobs, so-called green jobs in these sectors, that this will mainly go to male workers, employees, experts. But of course, we also risk that women's perspectives, women's needs, women's ideas in these sectors aren't really being taken up because they're not equally represented. So we're quite concerned about these things, and also by the fact that we haven't really seen a very close integration of gender equality policies and environmental and climate policies in the framework of the Green Deal. I mean, this is the political priority of this commission. On the one hand, the Union of Equality, and on the other hand, the carbon neutrality, the toxic-free future. But we don't see an integration of these policy areas, and we still see that these two policy areas develop pretty much in isolation from each other. So the European Green Deal in its initial communication didn't even refer to gender equality and wasn't at all based on any gender analysis. And now as all these policies are developing, whether it's on sustainable agriculture or mobility or chemicals or energy, you name it, we see that in many of these policies, we don't only have the underrepresentation of women in the decision-making process, we also have a lack of gender disaggregated data, of gender analysis informing these policies. And we, as a result, we see policies that do not really address how existing gender equalities have different impacts of men and women in the transition, or how we need to make sure that the policies that we put in place do not deepen the gap, which is already there, but help us to overcome the gender equality gap. So, you know, I could give some more concrete examples, but maybe I'll keep that for the next round.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, and so many lessons learned also from these practical examples that you mentioned. So hopefully it will improve future experiments or processes that will enable greater citizens in general participation and deliberation. But speaking about that, I want to also we mentioned different areas of underrepresentation of women and lack of participation. Heather Graebe, coming from the Open Society European Policy Institute, also wanted to ask you about the research that was recently done couple of years ago about the presentation of women at EU high-level policy shaping conferences across Europe that you have analyzed, speaking about an end to Manel's closing the gender gap at European top policy events. It's also not irrelevant arena where policies are being discussed and some decisions also sometimes being made, but where women are really underrepresented. What has your research showed us, and how? What are the reasons, and do you see any trends? Are they improving, and what would be the recommendations coming from this study?
Thank you very much, Maya. It's a pleasure to join you all today. Yes, the study you're referring to was actually organised by my colleague Crystal Morehouse, to give her due credit. And it was a big study on the gender gap in high-level policy conferences in Europe, looking at speaking roles at more than 20 conferences over 6 years between 2012 and 2017. But I can assure you things have not improved a lot at some of them, particularly the Munich Security Conference is the most famous for both the number and the size of its manels. Manels can be between 4 men or 7 men, or even sometimes 20 men with no women at all. And we found that some topics are extraordinarily male dominated. Foreign policy, the share of men in speaking roles exceeds 75%. The EU, security, economics, climate and energy, technology, in all of these areas, it's usually 3 out of 4 of the speakers are men. And often then the woman gets the role of the moderator, so not speaking, but chairing the conversation, which gives them more time to speak. But it's the percentage of female speakers is not much higher than 1 in 4 on other topics. For example, ranging between 1/4 and 1/3 on media, on democracy, education, health, immigration, and culture. The only area where women are massively overrepresented and men are deeply underrepresented is, of course, debates about gender. Essentially women are assumed to know what they're talking about only when they speak about gender issues. Now, the organizers of these conferences have often pointed out, well, it's because we're recruiting speakers from policymaking and decision making, and women are underrepresented in the top level positions in these sectors, so they end up being underrepresented also in the debates that influence them. But there's a lot of chicken and egg. There's a circle here that goes on, that the less women are able to speak in public, the less easy it is for them to make their names, for them then to get these top level positions. And on the whole, women tend to have more credentials than men, more qualifications, a higher position, greater seniority, to be asked to speak in the first place on a hard topic like security or economics. We have to prove the value of our words and our views, whereas our male counterparts are assumed to know what they're talking about from the start. Now, there have been some improvements, and in particular, I have to say some of the policy conferences we called out as being particularly male-dominated have since gone to great lengths to try to improve their number of women on speaking on panels, there has been some improvement, but there's a huge need for improvement in women of color in particular, who represent only 3% of panelists at top policy conferences. For example, and this is also the case in parliaments, 40% of MEPs are now women, but Black women are severely underrepresented in the European Parliament, with only 5 of the Parliament's 705 elected members being women of colour. It's really quite striking. So we see this pattern over and over again, and clearly we need to actively bring fresh perspectives on democracy, security and economics into the debate. It's also really important to get men to talk about gender. I find it really encouraging when men describe themselves as feminists, and the number of men who are prepared to engage actively in debates about why it's valuable to have the diverse life experiences of women and the perspectives of the gender that is in fact more than half of the population in these top policy debates, because that's where policy gets shaped, and having their perspectives means that it's more likely that policy will suit the more than half of the population that is women. So I hope there will be further improvements. But just to finish on the most important issue facing us as in these days, which of course is the terrible conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly. This is really Putin's war. There is actually a strong link between gender and authoritarianism, because it's easy to make gender a divisive issue. It's something that authoritarians love to do. They love to exploit fears and anxieties linked to the increasingly complex, interconnected and uncertain world. So it's no coincidence that Vladimir Putin has also had women as a target, and particularly upholding the enforcement of traditional gender norms and hierarchy, which we've seen a great deal in Russia. Putin eased penalties for domestic violence in Russia, for example, to the point that the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the Russian government had failed to combat domestic violence effectively. And we've also seen, very worryingly, signs of pushback in other areas, also on in legal terms. For example, in Azerbaijan, authoritarians last year used a smear campaign to target women's rights activists. We've seen in Turkey President Erdogan complaining that the Istanbul Convention criminalization of marital violence threatens the order and sanctity of marriage, his words. And we've seen even inside the European Union, the Hungarian government, including in its titled anti-pedophilia law, a ban on portraying gender reassignment in content such as school education material. And in Poland, of course, very notoriously, there was the new government, the PiS government adopted a near total abortion ban. So it's really important that the legal side is also addressed. So I'm very encouraged, just to finish with, about the move of the European Commission today, particularly on criminalizing domestic violence across the European Union. It shows we need to keep making progress on this, even in times of conflict and great anxiety and an active hot war on our continent, because the link between authoritarianism and suppression of women in particular is very strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for making that point and that link to the wider context and issue of the undermining of the democracy as such, when having a lack of gender equality in political life and representation. And I will go to Jérôme now again, because you also mentioned in one of the, Heather, you mentioned in one of your arguments that women have qualifications and they have the profile to be represented, for example, at the European high-level conferences, but often are not represented. And this also refers to the representation in political decision-making bodies, Jérôme, that you mentioned, and the figures that you mentioned. Often we can hear that women are not interested, that women do not have qualifications, or even sometimes we hear what I read, that almost 50% of the Europeans believe that the major job and the priority job of women is to take care of the family and home. So is this definitely is part of the puzzle, but what are all the underlying reasons that are preventing gender parity in political life?
Thank you. Well, yes, thank you for highlighting some of the stereotypes or the things we hear commonly to justify maybe not using quotas, or to justify the lack of women and diverse representation. So as you mentioned, I think part of it is linked to the political, social culture, and education changing gender norms and stereotypes. Three of the main obstacles I'm going to mention are the care burden that mostly falls on women, violence against women and girls, and financial resources. But before going in more details, I just wanted to point out, as Heather mentioned before, the fact that it's important to keep in mind the diversity of women. So what is true for one woman is not necessarily true for the other, and each woman has her own experience depending on the different discrimination she might experience, and those sometimes cumulate to have bigger disadvantages depending on the socioeconomic background, the ethnicity, the sexual orientation, if it's a woman with disability or not, or her religion, etc. So that's important also to keep that in mind when we do policy making and when we gather data. So in terms of the main obstacles I'm going to mention today, a big one for women's participation in politics and also for better representation is the unequal division of care responsibilities, because it's mostly women that take care of either the kids or the elderly, etc. So we need in European member states accessible, affordable, and high quality care services and infrastructure, so that women have the time needed to fully enjoy their right and fully participate in the democratic processes and be involved in politics if they want to, because sometimes they just don't have the material time to take these endeavors. Another one is something else I wanted to say on that. It's not only about having the infrastructure and having the services, it's also about mainstreaming gender when we do policies on care and the care economy. So keeping in mind what a policy on healthcare, for instance, how it would impact women and men, how it would impact the equality between women and men. So that's also quite important. Then another barrier that it's a huge one is violence against women and girls, because today activist women or women politicians or only candidates, women candidates are mainly hugely targeted by online violence, hate speech, online abuse. So that's a huge barrier, because often women censor themselves. They don't even try to run for election, for instance, or when they do, it's with high cost to their mental health and sometimes also physical health. But if we talk about online violence, let's talk about mental health more. So this kind of violence is a continuum of violence against women and girls. It's a silencing tactic to make sure women do not occupy the public space, and that's something we need to strongly tackle if we want to avoid having the democracies that don't have the interest of women at heart, that don't have their needs taken into account and addressed. So that's a gap that we really need to address. And in Europe today, you have 9 million girls before reaching the age of 15 that have experienced some kind of online violence. So this is huge, and that's something that we need to address. And one last obstacle I'm going to mention is, so I mentioned resources as in time earlier, but there is also money. So a lot of European governments have decreased their funds, their public funds for political parties, for the public space, for democratic processes. And that has mostly impacted women, because the people that are already part of political parties, that are already engaged in the political process, are mostly men at that point in time. So they're already in the process. So they're not as impacted as women that are not yet in the process and might need more financial means to join the process and be involved in the political fora. So that's also something that we need to be careful about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will want to go back to Anke, and we were discussing in preparation of the event that it's one very important event that is happening in March, a Commission on the Status of Women, where your organization will be actively working to bring women perspective and gender perspective on topics that are going to be in the focus, which is gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the context of climate change, environment, and disaster risk. And I was wondering how is this process going on from your perspective, and also if you can reflect a bit how was the civil society and women's civil society perspective represented at the climate conference in Glasgow last year, and what were your initiatives regarding this important event?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Maya. Yes, the climate COP last year, and I think what Heather and also Patricia have already said really much, very much reflects what happened at the COP26 last year. So in terms of really participation of women, I think the numbers, as you also said, Heather, they have changed in terms of gender balance. There are more women in government delegations, and they take part in the negotiations. However, if you look at the heads of the negotiation, of the government representations or delegations in particular, and those who are really taking the decisions, you don't find women represented there. So it's still, for example, we had a number from the UK delegation from COP26. They had 45% women in their delegation, but they were not installed in the decision-making positions. So that's still something where we need to look at. Gender balance does not mean that women's voices are really taken into account or that they have their voices heard. So that's something which is really important. The COP26 anyhow was very specific. It was very, that there was a strong gender imbalance, and it was predominantly male, white, and cisgender, the representation there. And that was, due to the fact that discriminatory visa procedures were in place. The costs for the accommodation were really high due to the COVID situation. And then there were really strict COVID restrictions, and also the vaccine restrictions were very strong, so or strict, and that really led to that the COP was quite exclusive. Of course, other observers and participants could join the negotiations virtually, but that's still something which is not, we all know it's not the same as if you are there in person, and some of the negotiations were not even streamed. So that was really difficult, and these kind of discriminatory practices really, and the specific setup at the COP26 led to also quite different results in terms of gender equality. So there was a lack of gender sensitivity in the decisions, for example, the greenwashing and the failed solutions that were kind of presented, an approval of nuclear energy, the carbon capture and storage, bioengineering, and all these kind of decisions were not necessarily gender responsive. Also, there was what was really aimed for was to have a lost and damaged fund but for the ones that already were affected by environmental degradation, but that had not happened. So that was quite disappointing. And if we now look at the Commission on the Status of Women and what is going to discuss there, because it is that this year's priorities theme is also focusing on climate, I really would like to refer to that methods of work document, which is reviewed this year, which is specific, and it's about the participation of civil society organizations. So it's not necessarily referring to women's participation, but at the Commission on the Status of Women, obviously we have a lot of gender and women's organization being represented. So the draft that has been presented at that stage really encourages member states to include more representatives of NGOs in their government delegations, which is really good, but we also want to see those NGOs then being able to be part of the negotiations, which is often not the case. For example, for the German government, it means that they have so many different ministries being involved in these negotiations that they often do not have a seat for an NGO, even though they have lots of NGOs in their delegation, but not a seat in the negotiations. And I think that's also quite important. And then this paper also, this draft calls for the full and meaningful participation of civil society, in particular in online or hybrid negotiations, as they are taking place since 2 years, and that's something which is quite crucial for the civil society. If we look at our recommendations or our calls that we have in relation to that draft document, I think it's really important that we have prior and early participation of women's and girls' human rights and feminist organizations in the preparatory process of the Commission on the Status of Women. That has not been the case often at that stage, and that includes obviously the funding for those organizations, which is key and is not guaranteed widely. The other call, which is important, is the granting of access to observe the negotiations. That is in other international fora definitely the case for NGOs, but it's not at the CSW. So that's something where we also strongly try to fight for. And then also the need to stress more on the intersectional aspects, because as Jermaine also said, I mean, women and all their diversity, so there's a lot of various views and differences that have to be taken into consideration. If we look at the draft agreed conclusions that are discussed at this stage, but also being postponed, the discussions due to the Ukraine-Russian war, we again try to fight the false solutions that we have been doing under the climate COP. We fight for a gender-just energy transformation. We kind of need more text on chemicals. So there are various points that are not reflected there, but as I said, that's still under discussion, and the next towards the end of this week, we have probably a new draft, and then during the CSW, which is starting on next Monday, the negotiations will go on. So that's on my side. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Obviously, so many issues to address very early at the early stage of processes, especially these complex processes like this one taking place in the international arena. We are going around many topics, but there are so many issues. I also have a couple of more questions I want to ask. So I will just briefly go to Patricia and Heather, and then we will see if there are some comments and questions from the people following us on social media. Patricia, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned already the gender equality and not really this being incorporated or organically developed with the EU Green Deal, so to say. European Commission says it's committed to the gender mainstreaming in EU policies, and it's also stated in the EU gender equality strategy. But how do you think this should be done when it comes to what would be the best case scenario when it comes to environmental sustainability policies, and what would be your recommendation from your experience?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, there has been a change now, but we still have to see in how far this actually results in better and more gender just policy. So now with kind of an equality task force in place and the obligation for the different DGs and the different policy areas to do kind of a gender impact assessment or gender, analysis before they develop new policies. I mean, I hope that this will result in policies in the future that are more gender aware and gender just. But this is a really recent development, so we'll have to see. We will have to see the results in the coming months and years. But I can mention two or explain with two examples how we think this is not yet happening. One example is around sustainable mobility, which of course is one of the big topics when we talk about the transition to carbon neutrality, the transition to sustainability. Transport, of course, is a key area, and it's also an area which people out there, citizens, really care about a lot, and it keeps coming up at one of the main areas of concerns. People want to be mobile, but of course they understand that it has to become more sustainable. So there's a lot of research that shows that gender is the most determining factor when it comes to us as individuals making mobility choices. We know that, for instance, women have less access to private cars, women depend more on public transport, women walk more, men, on the other hand, travel more, which is also why their individual CO2 emissions are much higher than women's. Men have more access to private cars, use public transport less often, walk less, and have different mobility patterns, which are due to gender stereotypes and gender roles in society that persist, mainly around care work, which make women's mobility needs more complex, because men, and it's a stereotype, but it's often true, men's mobility needs often focus on going from A, which is where they live, to B, which is their work, and going back home to A, whereas women's mobility patterns are more complex because they do have a job, but then they also have a lot of more care responsibilities, going to schools, kindergartens, shopping, visiting family members, etc., etc. So there are quite different mobility patterns and needs. Women, of course, also have other safety needs when it comes to, for instance, public transport. Just yesterday, I saw a study that was done in Brussels, which has shown that 1 in 3 women in Brussels are afraid of becoming victim of harassment, sexual assault, etc., on public transport, and avoid public transport because of that. And yet, if you look at mobility policies, strategies, investments, very often the mobility systems that are put in place are modeled on the average white, able, cisgender man, and not on the needs of a woman, of older people, of people with disabilities, or of people who belong to groups that feel vulnerable in public transport. So that's just one example. And if you look at the debates in the recent years around sustainable mobility, there's a lot of focus on individual e-mobility. There's nothing wrong, and it's important that we switch from combustion engines to, let's say, electric vehicles. But again, who has access to cars? Do we all equally use cars and have access to cars? Are there gendered patterns? Are there patterns that are linked to income, to where people live? So of course we cannot just focus on individual e-mobility, but we also have to have massive investments in public transport, and in public transport that works for all, and that also answers to, for instance, the safety needs of female users of public transport systems. So that's one example. Another example that I also find quite telling is agricultural policy and all the policies regarding sustainable food systems, which is another key sector in the transition. And I think agriculture is another example of a highly segregated workplace where policies and also investments and subsidies are modeled around the average male farmer. However, in Europe, 95% of the farms are family owned and run, which means there are women in farming. There are women who work on farms, there are women who manage farms, there are women who have other jobs to make investments into the family farm, but these women are not visible when it comes to farmers' representation, when it comes to policy making on agriculture, when it comes on to associations representing farmers. Women's work contribution, financial contribution to food production in Europe isn't visible at all. And we know nothing about, or not nothing, but close to nothing about the role of women farmers in Europe's agricultural system. There's very little research on that and very little data on it, which means policies can't really respond to that. At the same time, we do have research that shows that women farmers are more open to sustainable farming methods. They're more open to regenerative farming, organic farming. They're more supportive of animal welfare. They're more open to farm-to-fork strategies. So we have all these objectives when it comes to reducing agriculture's environmental and climate footprint. And we do have women farmers who seem to be very open-minded and even innovative on these issues. But then the policies and the investments made and the support offered doesn't tap into that potential, because we don't even know what women farmers contribute, and we don't build support systems that help these women farmers to scale up their ideas and to make a substantial contribution in that field. So these are just two policy areas, and then there's many others where we see that disconnect between, on the one hand, trying to achieve our environmental and climate objectives, and on the other hand, a commitment on paper to gender equality, but then policies who just lack even the basic data to ensure that these policies can move from being totally gender blind to being gender transformative.
Thanks, and thank you for mentioning the importance of analysis and data, which would support the more gender sensitive, or to say more appropriate policies in different arenas. And the two you mentioned are really very interesting. Many aspects didn't even come to my mind when thinking about it. I want to ask Heather, who is of course a woman in leadership position in civil society here in Brussels. I wanted to ask you, from your personal experience, if you want to share something with us, what did you see as, because you were also in the positions in the European Commission and in European institutions, what did you experience as an impediment or obstacle when performing your duties, or even now? What would be your recommendation for young women, for example, watching us today?
Well, I think the world is changing quite fast, so things are getting better, and it's really important to lean into opportunities that arrive, and women shouldn't feel at all intimidated about going into policy. I think that's the first thing, is the opportunities are much greater than they used to be, and Finally, there is a feeling of pressure on employers, including the Commission and the institutions, but also NGOs and companies, to increase the number of women in the workforce and in leadership positions. So this is a critical moment not to give up hope, but in fact to push forward despite all of the obstacles. I think the biggest problems that I encountered myself were about just not being heard. I would have to say the same thing 3 or 4 times to get the point across, whereas my male colleagues could say it once. Sometimes I would say it, then the male colleague would say it, and then it would get taken up. And that means you have to be really very articulate, but also choose your moment to push things in. But it's ridiculous that that's more so for women than it is for men. The other thing that I think is hugely valuable and important is for women to stand their ground on the full range of issues, and not only speak up on issues where they feel they have particular expertise as a woman, but on issues where they have expertise as a human being, as a person. That's really important too, and that there's a broader debate, and that women feel fully qualified to contribute from their life experience, their knowledge, and so on, and they don't allow the debate to be dominated by men who may have no greater knowledge or experience than they do, but who are simply more confident in speaking out because they're used to being listened to. So there's a vicious circle between not being listened to and not speaking out, and we can't give up on that. We keep having to push. And then I think the issue of data that Patricia was just illustrating with all those fantastic points just now is really key. And I wonder if, I think this is a subject maybe we could all chip in on, this question of how far gender impact assessment is helpful. I was really struck by reading the book by about Invisible Women by Carolina Criado Perez, where she goes into the way that the data that's biased and that routinely excludes women causes all kinds of problems for us in the world. I mean, she gives examples that phones are too big for women's hands, typically, not mobiles so much as the old ones, but workplace temperatures are uncomfortable. Car accidents are more likely to result in serious injury for women because the crash test dummies where the cars are designed around are basically male bodies. And also things like heart attack symptoms among women are ignored. So this kind of gender data gap is really pervasive and generally unintentional bias in assumptions and research. By excluding women, it really does, it results in much worse policy. From government policy, medical research, technology, workplaces, urban planning, and the media, and all of these factors that Patricia was just referring to as regards mobility, it's really time to bring women back into the picture and make sure that the data is there, that there's a real understanding of the day-to-day experience of women, and especially these issues around the care economy. We're so used to the fact that women take the lion's share of caring for children. And of course, during COVID, that became so much worse and so much more obvious. But also, as the population ages in Europe, more and more looking after also the parents and the grandparents. So women doing all this unpaid care work in addition to their paid work, in addition to all of their other roles in society. This is an enormous burden, and there's also a huge data gap on that, because of course that kind of work is not just not taken into account. It doesn't even contribute towards GDP, which is another reason why GDP is not a very accurate measure of, certainly not of economic well-being, but even of economic activity, because the unpaid economic contributions of women are simply not there, which ends up being a huge proportion of the economy. So I think these elements are ones where all of us have a role. Everybody who's involved in policy, whether in the institutions or in or outside, has a role to play by pushing forward this kind of data and demanding that these issues are heard and speaking out on them, whether we feel confident or not, because as women, we do actually have experience of all of these issues.
Thank you so much. And we have raised so many questions, and I'm feeling afraid to add additional perspective to this one. So I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. European Movement International we'll try to also to extend our activities and efforts in advocacy and activities and campaigns that will contribute to the gender equality in all spheres of our life, and in that way also strengthen European democracy. I really want to thank you all, and thank you all who were following. Unfortunately, we don't have time. I have several other issues and questions that we wanted to raise, but I want to end by congratulating to all of you International Women's Day again, and to hope that this debate with exquisite women from Europe, from the civil society of Europe policy, think tanks that will at the end inspire you, especially young women, to have more confidence and to really speak up and contribute to the quality of our European democracy. Thank you very much. Goodbye.